the university.
Thank you, Bastian. So, in fact, on behalf of the school this morning, I'm being delegated by the Dean of the school, Caroline Roussel, who unfortunately can't be with us today, just to say a few words to welcome everybody. She thought it would be nicer to have a real person rather than a pre-recorded video. So you've got me in my role today as director of IC, which is the Intercultural, the ESEG Center for Intercultural Engagement, and in my role here at ESEG as the Intercultural Coordinator, or the track coordinator. So I coordinate all of the courses here, bachelor's, master's, postgrad courses in intercultural communication, intercultural management. Caroline Roussel, our dean, is quite unique here at ESEG. Firstly, she's the first woman dean we've ever had in the 60 years history. So that's quite a change. And she's also the first dean we've ever had who is not an alumna of the school. She's come from something else. So we've had a few changes around here. And she's also the first dean who is not based here in Lille, but is based on our Paris campus, which has been a big change for all of us. Caroline was also very much the driving force behind a deep visioning process that the school went through in 2015. Over an 18-month period, we interrogated all of our stakeholders about how they saw us, what they thought our vision was, our mission, etc. And after that 18-month period, we went away for 3 days. I think there were 350 of us on a residential stay where we co-created a vision and a mission. And the vision we came up with was that in 2025, ESEG would be a unique international hub empowering change makers for a better society, which is not bad for management school, I think. That's what we decided we wanted to be. And our mission, first line of our mission, is to educate managers to be ethical, intercultural pioneers of change. That's what drives everything we do. When people ask, why do you do things? We tell them because we have a vision and because we have a mission. Actually makes my life very easy. So last year, because 2025 is tomorrow, we went away again, 300 of us for 2 days this time. And we asked a very simple question, which was, does this vision still hold? Is this mission still relevant? And we came up with an answer, which was yes, which to a very large extent is why we're here today. Because when CEDA Europa approached the school, and when I asked Caroline, can we host the Congress? She immediately answered yes, because this is part of the DNA of the school. What we hope is that everybody who comes through the school, students, staff, faculty, cultural intelligence will somehow be part of their DNA, part of the makeup that they have. So on behalf of Caroline, welcome to everybody. I hope you have a super 3 days and enjoy our new, this is what we call the village, ESEG village. So enjoy your 3 days in the village. And with that, I hand over to Papa.
Jërëjëf Grant kontaan naa trop ci bis bi. Do you have a translator for Wolof Senegal? Anyway, muchas gracias, Perevindre. I'm doing Papa Bala Ndong, soc de Senegal. I'm proven en el país Valencia fa. We have a translator for Catalan. C'est pas grave. Comme on est en France, je vais essayer de parler français. Merci pour tout le monde. C'est un immense plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue au congrès de CEDA Europa. C'est un événement très riche et qu'il s'agit de l'écosystème de l'interculturalité. Alors, je suis très heureux aussi d'avoir l'opportunité de présider cette séance. Do you have a translator for French? Anyway, I will try to speak English because I have my speech. I can say, dear esteemed colleagues, distinguished guests, and fellow interculturalists, it is with immense pleasure and honor that we welcome you to the Theatre Europa Congress 2024. Set against the backdrop of the beautiful and inspiring city of Lille, France. As we gather under this year's compelling theme, systems, the ecosystem of interculturalism, we are reminded of the interconnectedness that fortifies and tests our work over diverse professional domains. This Theatre Europa Congress 2024 is more than an event. It is a collaborative arena where academia, the public sector, nonprofit organization, business corporation, and the arts and media converge. Our focus on competence in intercultural profession is designed to equip us with innovative knowledge, advanced skills, essential tools, and adaptive action, all crucial for excelling in our increasingly globalized and diverse societies. Over the next few days, we will delve into profound exploration and dialogues, learning from world-renowned experts and each other. We aim to share best practice, navigate the complexities of intercultural interaction, and inspire on one another to seek for excellence in our respective field. Let us capture this unique opportunity to expand our professional networks, enhance our intercultural competencies, and collectively advance the discourse on global interculturalism. Together, we can forge pathways that not only understand, but also celebrate the diversity that defines our world. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to see the outcomes of our collaboration and the lasting impact this Congress will undoubtedly have on our professional journeys and beyond. There are a few more people I would love to thank here, as it is only through the many volunteering hours these people have put into this event that we all can be here today. I want to say Suzanne for coordinating the steering committee. Steve for holding all the tech segments together. Adrian for keeping the budget. Christine Lange for handling payments. Joe and his team, including Kay, Annette, Christine, Jonah, Pepe, Albertina, and Asanatu for making sure sustainability stays on top of everyone's mind. And for sure, Dan Douglas for being our link to this wonderful place and arranging everything here. Nadia for handling all the communications. Almendra for finding and working with sponsor. Shaolin for leading our wonderful team of Congress assistants. And for sure, Bastian, who dreamed up the program topic and lead the program team, including Magdalena, who underled the pre-Congress workshop. For Bastian and Magdalena, and now Elia, who found and worked with the keynote speakers. Ayla. Eileen, who handled all the submissions and the review process. And finally, Margot, who revived it and worked on the program logic. If I have forgotten to mention someone, please accept my profound apology. I just want as well finally to extend my heartfelt thankful to all of you, because without you, we don't have Shetra. And now, my friends, let's make this Shetra Europa Lille 2024 an unforgettable involvement filled with learning, growth, and inspiration. Thank you so much. And now I hand over to the program.
Thank you. All right, I have the beautiful task to tell you about some logistics, everyone's favorite things. So just a few things for housekeeping. There are no classes in this school right now. However, some people are working in the offices, and they probably would like to do that as undisturbed as they can. So when we are in the corridors, let's be respectful of these people. Coffee is fantastic, and it will be there at coffee breaks. Meaning, during the coffee breaks, the coffee will be over there. When there's not a coffee break, there won't be coffee. So if you require coffee in the morning, make sure you arrive at your desired level of caffeination and don't count on you getting a second or first breakfast here before everything starts. There is a little table with gluten-free options that we would love to be for the people who actually need gluten-free options. So if you don't really need it, don't take it. We're in France, meaning air conditioning is not really a thing here. However, windows are fantastic. So if your room gets warm, we hope for some sun, maybe some clouds, but maybe some sun. Then don't ask for the air conditioning to be switched on, because that's the windows that you can open by yourself. There's no trash bins in the rooms where we will be working. So please take whatever trash you create and bring it into the recycling bins that are in the corridor. Don't leave it in the rooms. Same goes for coffee cups. When you take your coffee and you want to drink it elsewhere, that's totally fine. But afterwards, please bring the cup back here. We don't really have people that walk around trying to find missing coffee cups. So make sure wherever you take your coffee from, you bring your coffee cups back to where you got them from. Water fountains to fill your beautiful little bottles. There are 3 on the ground floor. There is 1 on the first floor, 1 on the second floor. Make sure you stay hydrated, because otherwise you won't be, and that's not good. Lunch, also very good. In order to get lunch, if you booked lunch, you need lunch tickets to get your lunch, which you can get at the reception area here if you haven't gotten them yet. And finally, the app that we're using for kind of intra-Congress communications. If you have any problems, any tech issues, Steve up there will be in the morning in the reception area here. If you have questions, he will probably have answers. And then finally, from the sustainability team, there are QR codes everywhere that you can scan, because we want to do a survey on the actual carbon footprint of this Congress, so that we can have a benchmark that we can try to lower over the years. But for that, we need to know where we're starting. We hope we start low, but we want to know where we start. So please fill in that questionnaire so that we have some data actually on the environmental impact of this Congress. Otherwise, it's all empty words without the data. And so then, just 1 or 2 words on the program of this Congress, actually. It's about systems, right? It's about how things are interconnected. It's where ideas come from, where ideas are going. And we had a pre-Congress keynote presentation by Nadine Lamourie-Baja, who was there. Can I see some of her hand? Okay, a few people. You might remember that she talked about 3 resources. And they were quite beautiful resources. They were not knowing, confusion, and feeling disarmed. And they feel like that's not really a good thing to have. But I think for the Congress here would be a beautiful thing if we were more often than not in a state of not knowing, because then we can find out new things. If we were more often than not in a state of confusion, because then we're not certain, and then we can learn new ideas. And if we were more often than not feeling disarmed, so that we are actually vulnerable to ideas that might be uncomfortable, that might be unpleasant, but that might expand our horizons. And with that, I would like to give the word to Ayla, who will introduce our keynote speaker for today.
Thank you. Terve kaikille ja tervetuloa tänne myös mun puolesta. Welcome to this Congress. It's really lovely to see so many people here and you coming like physically present. And I have a genuine pleasure to introduce the Professor Thomas K. Nakayama from Northeastern University of USA. Why I wanted specifically him to come here is because he has been a real trailblazer in critical intercultural communication. He has been also many times renounced, nominated, for example, as a distinguished scholar or research fellow by several communication associations in USA, also rewarded with the Distinguished Scholar Award for his lifetime scholarly achievement by the North, and now I have to look that, North National Communication Association. So that was not NCA in the USA as well. He has actually published and researched about wideness already at 1990s from very different perspectives, like looking wideness as a strategy, wideness as a communication of social identity, socio-historical foundations of wideness, interrogating the communicative power of wideness, to name a few articles that he has written about the topic. As well, he has been looking into cultural communication for intersectional perspective in addition to race, and categories and ideas about race and racialization. For example, co-founding and being co-founding editor of a journal in GLBTQ world making. In the field of critical intercultural communication, or I could say developing the field of critical intercultural communication, one important insight has been the bringing the context in the forefront of analysis and research. And there he has, for example, co-authored a book of intercultural communication in context with Judith and Martin. And also being founding editor of a journal of intercultural and international communication, which offered a real platform for critical analysis of intercultural communication that was missing for quite some time. And then last but not least, he has edited a handbook of critical intercultural communication together with Rona Tamiko Halualani, which has just recently got the second edition. So please, everybody, to the bookstores after this. So please join me welcoming Dr. Professor Nakayama to speak for us today.
I just want to thank Ayla and the programming committee for inviting me here. It's a real honor to come and speak to you. That was a very generous introduction. What I wanted to talk about today is what the project of critical intercultural communication is and where it comes from. And one of the things I think that might make it easier to understand is to understand the context in which it developed. One of the academic study of intercultural communication in the United States traces its roots to the specific decision coming out of World War II to establish a Foreign Service Institute. Now, one of the strands, as you know, that runs through American culture is what's called isolationism. And this means that Americans should take care of America and invest our money in our roads, our bridges, and so on, and not be spending money on countries around the world. This comes from a reaction from a lot of immigrants from Europe who said we left Europe to leave all that behind. And World War I, there was a lot of fighting about whether or not we should get involved. And they called it, some people called it the Great European War because it was seen as Europe's problem, not ours. And that's part of the reason the United States was very late in getting involved in the First World War. But by the Second World War, coming out of the Second World War, that isolationist movement had really been overtaken by people who said, coming out of World War II, the United States is the dominant power in the world, and we need to be involved in stuff that goes on outside of the United States, which, of course, we have been very involved, not always in good ways, but we've been very involved in stuff outside. And so in 1946, the United States Congress passed the Foreign Service Act, which established the Foreign Service Institute, which was an institute designed to help foreign service workers adapt to their assignments all over the world in embassies and consulates and working abroad. And the Foreign Service Institute today still exists, and it's open to people outside of the State Department workers. Of course, it's not free. Nothing in the United States is free, including healthcare. But that's one of the things that you have to pay. Yeah, you have to pay for. But one of the early leaders of the Foreign Service Institute was a man named Edward Hall, and you probably read some of his stuff. And I think one of the things that was really important to him was that the Foreign Service Institute be multidisciplinary. So he hired linguists, he hired psychologists, sociologists, and so on. And he himself was an anthropologist by training, but he didn't think any one field had all the answers for understanding intercultural interaction. And that was part of that move. Now, as the study of intercultural communication developed, it moved from within, when it moved to the universities, it moved into departments of communication largely in the United States, which means it got separated from the study of other languages. Now, some places in other parts of the world, language study is intimately linked with the study of intercultural communication, but not in the United States, because that's a different department. And that's their terrain, and departments are very territorial about their terrain. But as a newcomer into departments of communication, one of the tensions that developed was this need to gain legitimacy for intercultural communication, because it was sort of the new kid on the block, the new area. And one of the ways that they thought that they could establish legitimacy was adopting a more scientific approach to the study of intercultural communication. And so by the 70s and 80s, it was largely dominated by research done by quantitative social science methods. And so many of you know that there were large surveys done, and culture became a variable that would explain why Russians do this, Mexicans do that, Japanese do this, Germans do that. And there was lots of information from large-scale surveys doing this kind of research. But that also meant that by the late 80s and into the 90s, there was a reaction to that kind of research. And you can probably imagine that there were lots of reasons for this reaction. Many of these studies, people in some of these groups felt like that didn't accurately describe their culture and who they were. And it made stereotyping easy. German people do this, or Japanese people do that, and it's easy to start stereotyping people. And this is part of the reason that we, in critical intercultural communication, decided that we needed to think differently about how we know about other cultures and how we understand other cultures. Now, that doesn't mean that the research that those people were doing isn't relevant or wasn't helpful, but Judith Martin and I came up with this argument that we should really think about the relationship between the paradigms as well as the way that we think about intercultural communication as a dialectical relationship. And so there's a number of dialectical tensions that are going on. And one of the things that we argue is that we need to understand cultural differences, but we also need to understand cultural similarities. Cultures are different, but they're also similar, and that's a dialectical tension. Or people belong to a particular culture, but they're also individuals. So just because you meet somebody from a particular culture doesn't mean that they share all of those characteristics of that culture. So you've probably seen some of those studies, like Americans smile among the most of people around the world, and Russians, I think, are among the least. But that doesn't mean if you meet a Russian person, they don't smile, or you meet an American person, they're smiling all the time. Those kinds of things, that people are individuals and they're also part of a culture. And so that was one reaction. Oops, another reaction. It's okay. Were people who felt that cultures were more complex than that, and that many of there are other cultures happening, going on at the same time that have been overlooked in some of these studies. Deaf people argue that they have a culture and that they, have their own cultural way of communicating and so on, and yet people aren't studying them. And gay and lesbian people felt that they weren't being studied. There were many other cultural groups, and that culture is much more complex than simply a variable where all Americans are alike or all Mexicans are alike or something that falls along the similar lines. And this was part of the reason for this difference. And this is where my own work in whiteness comes from, because in a lot of these studies, there were also studies that were done on racial and ethnic minority groups, especially African Americans in the United States. And many African Americans said this didn't reflect, who they felt that they were and the way that they communicated, and that this wasn't what their culture from their experience was about. And so I suggested to some of my colleagues who were doing some of this work, why don't we do surveys on white Americans and ask them what they want to be called, how they feel about being white, and then we can come up with these same kinds of generalizations about white people. And they pushed back and said, it's different with white people. We're individuals. You can't lump us all together in the same way. And that's part of the reason I decided that there's something different about white identity that needs to be interrogated. And that's part of the reason that I did this work. And part of it is arguing that it's used strategically and it's not just simply, you know, a characteristic, but in the way that it plays out in public discourse is very much a strategic kind of discourse. So this is part of the, I don't have the clicker. Oh, yeah. Oh, it's okay. So there is no specific starting point for critical intercultural communication. There are a number of people that were working on similar kinds of projects at the same time, but it was an attempt to understand many of these power relationships between groups and why certain kinds of things happen in cultures. You need to understand the inequalities and power relationships between groups. So for example, I'll just give you a personal example. My mother's family was immigrated in the early 1900s to the United States from Japan. And they were a Japanese speaking family until the internment. When they were in the internment camps, well, they're using the word incarceration now, but when I was growing up, they were called internment camps. They were told not to speak Japanese because the guards couldn't understand Japanese. They had to speak English. And when they came out of there 4 years later, they never went back to being a Japanese speaking family. I mean, a little bit, but they would say certain things, but it was not the same. And that has reverberated to my generation and so on. Once you lose a language, it's hard to get it back. But that history helps explain the contemporary situation, and the power inequality between different groups within the US has reverberations for people's identity, how they think about themselves, and how they communicate. All of these things, history is an important part of understanding that. And that's why I think critical intercultural takes history seriously, because it's an important part of understanding what's going on. So for example, when I went to Vietnam, there are many signs in Hanoi, for example, that are written in Vietnamese, but also in French and English. And if you know the history of Vietnam, it helps understand why that is, why it's written in French and English as opposed to other languages. And this whole history can explain a lot of these things that connect cultures as well as create tensions between cultures, and why some cultures, you know, feel affinity for other cultures and opposition to others. And history helps explain some of these kinds of tensions. So for example, Rwanda is an interesting example. Oh, yes. So what I did here, so critical intercultural communication takes ideas and is influenced by stuff that's going on in ethnic studies, race studies, gender studies, sexuality studies, and so on, as part of the project of expanding how we understand cultures and cultural interaction. Now, what I did was Rona and I went through, and since the first handbook of critical intercultural communication came out in 2010, the second one just came out. We went and looked at all of the different articles that had come out in that period and where critical intercultural communication is going. And so it has really expanded in terms of the kinds of stuff that it's doing. There's a lot of, you can see that it's really expanded in terms of what people are doing, the projects they're taking on, and how they think about it. Okay. And where they're looking at, because in the 80s, a man named Robert Shutter did a quantitative study where he looked at what kinds of cultures were being studied in intercultural communication. And as you can imagine, Japan was number one, Germany was up there, the economic powers were up there, but people were largely ignoring Africa and Latin America. And now people are studying Nigeria, people are studying South Africa and elsewhere, and looking at the world in a broader perspective. And I think that this is something that is an important part of what's going on. Whiteness is a part of it too. Okay. I mean, you don't need to memorize all of these, but you can see that there's a lot that's going on. And I think the point is that it's going. Okay, looking forward is the next one is fine. So one of the questions that we're asking is, what does it mean to do critical intercultural work? What this means is that there isn't a single method that's connected with it. If you look at the slides I showed, they're using a wide range of methods to understand how cultures come in contact and what difference it makes. There isn't one approach that people are using. What it means is that you're looking at power differentials, history, laws, for example, that create certain kinds of cultural groups. These kinds of things are that history and the laws around them have created cultural groups in ways that may or may not make sense outside of that particular culture. So for example, California used to have a law that you could only marry people within your same racial group. And one of the racial groups was non-white Caucasians. Non-white Caucasians are people, they counted people from South Asia and people from Latin America. So there are a lot of intermarriages in the Imperial Valley of California between people who were Asian Indian and Mexican American. And they created their own because of laws. Today in the United States, you know, the way that the US government classifies racial groups, one of the racial groups they classify as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Pacific Islanders are the indigenous people of islands owned by the United States. Not, I mean, Japan is islands, but they're not Pacific Islanders. But the Pacific Islanders have very different legal issues and land right claims more similar to American Indians and Alaska Natives, but they're not classified with them. They're classified with Asian Americans who are more concerned with immigration issues and other legal kinds of concerns that are completely different. But it's just because they say we look alike. And that's the logic, the racial logic there, you know, creates different kinds of groups and alliances that may not make sense outside of understanding what the laws are. And that's part of doing critical intercultural communication work. Okay. So within the field of intercultural communication, critical intercultural communication scholarship plays a particular role that's different than the social science approaches or the interpretive, more anthropological fieldwork approaches. Altogether, they give us a better view of what's going on. It doesn't mean that any one of them stand alone. And this is part of the argument that Judith Martin and I are making in the dialectical approach. These should be seen in dialectical tension, that there are important insights into understanding trends and cultures. And that's an important part of it. Okay. So we always have to think about what intercultural communication is going to be good at shedding light on. Obviously, there are blind spots in any of these approaches, but there are things that a critical approach can shed light on in terms of understanding why things are the way they are and what might be the future for thinking about different cultural groups. Okay, so I have a couple of touchstones here. One is culture. Now, from a critical perspective, culture is not something out there. It's a site of contestation. Or what we say is a struggle. There are different groups within a culture that are pushing to change that culture in different directions. And there are different reasons why. And part of it is understanding what those reasons are. I'll just give you another US example. Clarence Thomas, who is on the Supreme Court, has openly asked for another case to come forward on same-sex marriage, because he said he wants to overturn Obergefell, which was the earlier Supreme Court case that authorized same-sex marriage in the United States. And there are many people who are upset about that particular. There are still Americans upset about same-sex marriage, and so he's calling for another case. So it's a constant struggle over what a culture is, how it lives, and what it means, and different interests are pushing on that culture for different reasons. And you can see, I mean, from the United States perspective, it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of pushing on a lot of different issues, abortion. Recently, the right to have birth control came up before Congress, and it was voted down. So they tried to make it a legal right to have access to birth control. I know that this sounds crazy to some people, but this is where different interests are pushing back in different ways. And like in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and maybe in your country, I don't know, transgender issues are another hot topic, and people are pushing in different directions because they have different ideas. And so culture is static and dynamic, and there are ways that we need to think about that dialectical tension in terms of what's happening. Communication, what role does communication play in the development of, well, it could be on, critical people tend to look at the macro issues and these larger issues of how people are pushing in different directions. And so right now, the isolationist feelings in the United States have come back. Donald Trump calls it Make America Great Again. And this is part of the idea that we should be spending money on the United States and not on NATO or other people that are not us. And so this is part of the reason that he has threatened to pull out of NATO. I know Europeans are very aware of this, but that isolationist trend has come back. And this communication and how this communication operates and who's persuaded and how many people are persuaded and how it works is an important part of communication. The third is interculturality, which is it refers to that tension between intercultural and intracultural. So intercultural and intracultural is a distinction that used to be important in earlier work in the field, but critical people say that it is a dialectical tension between the two that you need to think about when you want to use certain intraculturality versus interculturality and why you're making this strategic choice. So, for example, when we think of the nation state, which some people critique as fairly recent modern development, is that a useful tool for intercultural thinking about other cultures? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. In other words, to think about Italian culture or German culture, sometimes it is helpful to talk about it in that nation state way, but sometimes there are other ways of talking about cultures that cross borders and things like that have nothing to do. It's not as useful to think in terms of the nation state. And so we need to think through all of these things when we're thinking about how we do our work. Now, of course, as academics, we're concerned about these issues, and a lot of this comes out of a more academic than practical kind of approach, which I think is something that's a little different from some of the other work, especially in CTAR, that people are doing that's more training and practice oriented. Okay, so what I wanted to do was, I think that's the last slide. No, lingering questions. Okay, so there are still some questions that, especially Rona and I were talking about this, and you can just put them all up there. You know, how do we identify what critical intercultural work is? We looked, when we did our review of the literature, we were looking for people who reference critical intercultural communication, but there are other people who do engage questions of power and culture from a critical perspective because they're looking for inequalities and ways that cultures came into contact that they weren't equal. It wasn't, they're paying attention to that. Have we focused enough on agency and the possibilities of resistance, negotiation, and action in terms of how cultures interact with other cultures? What is the role of the individual agents in having and shaping that? I think there's what aspects of power are we engaging at what levels? And there's different kinds of power. There's institutional as well as cultural, just gender bias and things like that, which isn't necessarily. And how can we maximize our use value, you know, in the work that we do beyond the academy? Because part of critical intercultural work is world making. Part of the call is that we should be engaged in some of these struggles outside of the university. And so many people, you know, were very involved after George Floyd was killed, but many other events after the Orlando shooting in the United States and so on. Are you familiar with that Orlando shooting? Yeah, okay. So I don't need to tell you about that. Okay, so I want to leave some time for questions because I know that I don't want to keep it. Okay, you got 9 minutes.
So, thank you very much. Now it's time for questions. There's the first one. You're coming.
Professor Nakayama, oh, it's loud, my God. Professor Nakayama, thank you very much. The questions that I would have, each field of study has its own definition of culture. Considering that you work in the field related to culture, how would you define culture in your field?
Well, Raymond Williams says that culture is one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language because it's used in so many different ways and it has such a complex. In terms of the critical people, it is any place where there's a site of contestation. So what they're fighting over and what are we fighting over is what is the point of people pushing to change a culture in a particular way. And so right now, in transgender, it's about what defines a male and a female. Is it what you identify with, or is it what you're biologically born? I think Rishi Sunak says he's going to solve the gender issue by just defining people by what they were born in order to make it simpler. But that's he's pushing in a particular direction, and other people are pushing in another direction.
Yep, Professor Nakayama, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I think it's really important that we put more accent on these critical approaches, which have become very influential in the past few decade or so, as you pointed out. My question is, you reminded us at the beginning that the critical approaches emerged also as a reaction to maybe essentializing visions of different groups. And at the same time, with multiple calls for social justice, it seems that a lot of the critical discourse today maybe doesn't quite escape some kind of neo-essentialism in that it brings everything back to one agenda. And I was wondering how, as a critical scholar, you'd position yourself on that.
That's difficult. Yes, it does. I know. I think what you're saying is that it essentializes different groups in a different way as a way of mobilizing social change. And I think we have to have that same dialectical tension between understanding that that's part of mobilizing social change is mobilizing people around particular identities or ideas. At the same time, we recognize that it's more complex than that. And it's just that dialectical tension, I think, that can help us navigate that. But without engaging in some of that public discourse, I don't think social change, you can mobilize people to social change in the same way.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the talk. You suggested strongly that intercultural communication originates, or at least grew at the same time as cultural studies, and then now it's called critical intercultural communication, which perhaps is also inspired or grew at the same time as critical race theory. And you've then mentioned Black Lives Matter at the end of your talk. And so I'm just wondering if you are experiencing any of the same backlash as cultural studies is with its critical race theory situation.
Yes, there is pushback because I think that well, for all of the same reasons. Some of you may know that Florida has banned teaching critical race theory in schools, even though I don't know that they really teach it. But they asked the legislator, well, what is critical race theory? Since you're voting to ban it, what is it? And he says, it's teaching anything that makes white people feel bad about being white. And I think that points to some of the whiteness stuff, but it also points to sort of where power lies and whose agendas are being set. And so, yes, and I think that some of that pushback, especially right now, there's a lot of pushback against all of the stuff that you mentioned, but also DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Many people who work in those areas lost their jobs at many universities in the United States because different states have banned funding any of that stuff. Hundreds at the University of Texas and elsewhere, because they the state will not fund that. Not all states, but each state is doing their own thing. But so yeah, there's definitely a backlash, not just intellectually, but in the public.
Thank you so much. I would like to relate to your third question here. What aspects of power are we engaging? How do you talk about power in this context, because when we talk about power, we mostly have this top-down, right? Powerful and powerless. Nevertheless, also victims have got a certain power because of their, yeah.
Right. That's part of the complexity of seeing culture as a society struggle, because there's so many different ways that power gets played out and how it gets played out. Some of you may know that under apartheid in South Africa, the school books that they used to teach South African history said that when the whites arrived, the blacks were coming down from the north. And so they came at the same time to South Africa as the whites. So the blacks have no more claim to South Africa than the whites. Now, archaeologists know that's not true. That there were people there long before the Europeans came to South Africa. And so after apartheid ended, there was a long project of rewriting the history textbooks. And so today, South Africans have very different, school children have very different understanding of South African history, but the power to write the textbooks is one that has been one of the sites for a lot of contestation over not just South Africa, Japan's history books, Saudi Arabia's history books, and so on. And even in the United States, the way that history is taught is a huge contestation. And so power can be in all kinds of different ways, and there's no one definition of power, but you're looking for how it gets exercised. And I just use that as an example, but there's so many different ways that power gets exercised. And doesn't mean that people who are out of power have no power, because obviously South Africa has changed.
There's one there. Can you just pass, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. You have mentioned your definition of culture, which is, I think, very different from the traditional fish in water iceberg definitions that we know. So I guess my question is, do you think, whether in academia or in training practice, these two sort of conceptualizations, so critical intercultural communication and the more positivist approaches, can they actually coexist and work alongside each other or not? And if so, how? So it's a big one.
Oh, that is a big one. I mean, for me, yes, they can, but they need to be, they're not using the same paradigmatic assumptions, but they are producing knowledge in different, and we do know that we think in different ways about cultures. It's as human beings. And so I think this is part of the dialectical argument, that you have this information in dialectical tension. French culture, for example, to talk about it in a static way, French culture has changed, over however hundreds of years or whatever. And so to think about French culture in a static way, or the French language even as in a static way. When I studied French many years ago, we learned the word jeton, which I don't think they use anymore. Before you could make a phone call, you had to buy these tokens, jeton, but obviously I don't think that word even exists. But you don't need that for making phone calls. And this is part of so understanding, yes, some of the characterizations of a particular culture are true at a particular time, but we have to keep in mind that cultures are always changing. Sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's social upheaval, sometimes it's economic things, and so on.
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting topic. I think this is a question that concerns all of us, and is disconcerting to all of us, given also the developments of right-wing populism all over the world, also here in Europe. And so your third point, what aspects of power are we engaging, at what levels? I think that is perhaps one that is more urgent for us to look at than define what is the level, what's the definition of culture. And I've recently read the book Strangers in Their Own Land by Ali Hochschild, a typical Democrat from Berkeley who spent 5 years in Louisiana speaking to people who would vote for Trump. And she has this metaphor of people trying to realize the American dream, and it's an uphill walk all the time, and the American dream is on the other side of the hill, and they've been walking and walking and trying to get there, and they're never getting there. and they don't know why. And now suddenly these people, these black people, are trying to kind of like pull over from the left side and get there first, which of course is it's just this. Maybe we also need to look at the socioeconomic and class discussion. Good old Marx, perhaps he had a point. So in order to also engage people who feel left behind, even though they are white.
Yes. There's a number of books that have been written about the same phenomenon. And I think that part of it is we have to understand that there are people who are struggling in the United States who are white, and they feel a certain entitlement that as white people, they're Americans, they're the indigenous people. And this is a communication strategy that was used in South Africa. They call themselves Afrikaners because they were the indigenous people. In Australia, they call themselves Australians, and you're supposed to think of a white person when you think of Australian. And this is part of a discursive strategy that gives them this particular feeling of privilege. And it's easy to blame other people for why, when you're a member of that group, that you somehow are not making it. And so you blame immigrants, you blame other people for getting ahead. Well, you're not getting ahead. And it's obviously, we know it's more complicated than just the color of your skin for why some people are getting ahead and not getting ahead. You wanted to add?
Maybe we also need to look at socioeconomic factors and how we can bring it to engage people, be left behind, whatever the skin color, because of socioeconomic reasons. And yeah, that's
Absolutely. And there have been calls among some people in the United States to raise taxes on the super wealthy. I mean, how much money does a wealthy person need? I mean, some of the rich people in the United States have their own space program. They don't have to rely. They're incredibly wealthy beyond imagination, and shouldn't the taxes on them be much higher than what we're charging them right now? In the previous period, in the 1950s, taxes on wealthy people were much higher than they are now. But there's been a constant cutting of taxes, and I think the maximum now is 38%, which is very low compared to for somebody, you know, who's extremely wealthy like that. And the rich are getting even richer and richer and richer, which is part of the reason there's been complaints. Like Jeff Bezos is incredibly wealthy, and he's losing, you know, millions every year with the Washington Post because newspaper subscriptions are going down. But and that's chump change to somebody who's that wealthy, and yet, you know, they're squeezing the Washington Post now, even because they're losing money, but the amount of money he's losing is chump change. And so, yes, the socioeconomic, we need to pay attention to that too, and especially the trends in the United States where the wealthy are getting wealthier than ever. The middle class is shrinking, and there's many more people who are struggling. And statistically, we know that that's true. And what is the answer? It's easy to say, oh, Trump is the answer, but I think it's more complicated than that. And I think that as people engaging with the public, we need to help people see that there's other things that are going on, and it's not simply Trump is going to save you.
That's a beautiful closing word.
Maybe. Maybe it was first, like, yeah, thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you.
So that was a lot about social justice, what we were actually talking about, in addition of as a basis of also critical intercultural communication analysis as such. Thank you very much for really lovely and interesting, thought-provoking presentation, as we saw, with a good number of questions. So let's have a coffee pause and continue with the exciting program. Exactly. Enjoy your day.